Hello, my name is Olga Pointer, Literacy Coordinator at Brecken. This presentation was put together by myself and Tanya Harvey, also a Literacy Coordinator for NLPS. Today we're going to talk about assessing language skills in oral storytelling. In particular, we will look at language arts, curricular connections and big ideas, ideas for collecting data, assessment resources, and reporting on oral language skills. We think it's important to always keep sight of the big ideas when you're planning, teaching, and assessing. Why are stories important? And why do we focus on oral storytelling at all? Well, because language and story can be a source of creativity and joy. We know how important creativity is, and sparking joy invites learning and belonging. Stories and other texts help us learn about ourselves and our families, and when we learn more about ourselves, it opens us up to learn about others and helps to build community. Stories and texts can be shared through pictures and words, not just words on paper, but words from our voices. And everyone has a unique story to share. Let's zoom in a bit and take a look at the curricular competencies. What do we expect our learners to do with oral storytelling? We want them to engage actively as listeners, viewers, and readers, recognize the structure and elements of story, and explore the oral storytelling process. Zooming in a bit further now into the content portion of the curriculum, what are students expected to know? They're expected to know the elements of a story, so for example, characters and setting, retelling a story, making personal connections, focusing on the speaker, so those listening skills, and metacognitive strategies. So for example, talking about yourself as a storyteller and reflecting. Now that we know how important oral storytelling is and how it pertains to the language arts curriculum, we'd like to share some ideas for collecting data. How do we know what they've learned? How will they show their knowledge? And what tools do we use to collect data? When we're looking at collecting formative data, there are a number of ways we can do this. The most common way would be to do observations and add anecdotal notes during a story workshop or during an oral story presentation. You could conference one-on-one or in small groups, video or sound recording of your students, and they could also assess themselves. And you could also use photos or children's drawings and describe their stories or have them record their voice. For summative assessments, you could review video recordings or use portfolios or collections of scribed stories, and then use rubrics to evaluate their oral storytelling skills. Some tips we found helpful when teaching and when collecting data is to display anchor charts and use tactile materials such as beads on a rope to help students remember the elements of story. And you can see there's a poster on the left that shows an example of this. Or you could use loose parts to recreate a scene in their story, or things like graphic organizers. You could co-create and display criteria or some tips for oral storytelling, such as a poster with story starters or connecting words. Here's an example of a rubric that Tanya and I created, and it includes scales for oral retelling, speaking, listening, and oral storytelling for early primary. We used a combination of resources to build this rubric, and we'll share those with you a little later. So just to take a closer look, this is oral retelling, and the goal, proficient, for each student would be to independently and accurately retell familiar stories with a beginning, middle, and end. For speaking and listening, the goal would be to speak clearly in full sentences with appropriate speed and volume, and listen to stories with minimal support, make eye contact, and make a connection. For oral storytelling, the goal would be for students to tell a detailed story with a beginning, middle, and end using some simple connecting words and appropriate vocabulary. Assessment resources. Where can you find additional information on oral storytelling? So here is the Ministry of Education's oral language continuum for kindergarten, which can be found on their website, or you can Google Kindergarten Emergent Literacy Continuum for oral language. The writing continuum in What's Next for This Beginning Writer is great for early primary, and it also has an oral language component. As well, Scholastic has assessment scales for grades kindergarten to 6. So you can also just Google Scholastic Oral Language Assessment Scales to find these. This brings us to our last section of the presentation, reporting on oral language skills. What language can we use to share learning with families? Here are some sample report card prompts that you could use when writing report card comments. Feel free to pause the video and take a screenshot of this slide. So some examples are speaks clearly during oral storytelling, retells familiar stories from memory, including characters, setting, and sequence of events, or uses tone of voice to enhance meaning of story. Oral storytelling is just one piece of oral language, so we invite you to visit the NLPS Learns website and check out the literacy planning and assessment resources for more information. Thank you, Heichka and Merci from Olga and Tanya.